Go ahead and get started probably in another 45 to 60 seconds. So we'll let a few more people come on in. Hope everyone's having a good PDC. Quick poll of the audience. How many people are using ASP.NET today? Excellent. Oh, cool. How many people are using Visual Studio to develop their ASP.NET apps today? Excellent. How many people are using other tools besides Visual Studio? Okay, good. Excellent. Hopefully we'll have something in this talk pretty much for everyone. Okay, so let's go ahead and officially get started. So my name is Scott Guthrie. I'm with, basically I run the ASP.NET development team as well as our Visual Studio web tools development team. And basically what we're going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes talking about is Whidbey. Specifically, I'm going to give kind of a broad overview of what we're trying to do in the web space in Whidbey. I'm talking specifically about ASP.NET as well as some of the things that we're doing in the Visual Studio web tool space. And then basically I'm going to spend about 35 to 45 minutes building code or writing code on stage. We're going to try to build an end-to-end app from scratch. It's going to show rich data editing, binding against a middle tier object layer. We're going to do opera caching using SQL-based database cache and validations. We're going to show off some of the new master page features, build a rich navigation system, do some cool personalization stuff, and hopefully show some of the power that we're introducing in the Whidbey timeframe. One thing I want to mention, this is true for not only my talk, but all the ASP.NET talks here at the conference, is the slides as well as the demos will be posted on this URL. I'll have it at the back as well. So a little bit later on, if you want to read the slides or preferably actually walk through some of the demos on your own machines, you can check out this URL and download it later in the week. All the bits and all the demos I'm going to be showing today will run on the Visual Studio or the Visual Studio and .NET Framework Whidbey Redis bits that you'll get today. So you'll be able to do everything I'm going to do on stage on your own time at a later date. So what I thought I'd start off talking about a little bit is what are we trying to do with ASP.NET and Whidbey. Fundamentally, we're trying to do four big things with the Whidbey release. The first one is what we call increased developer productivity. Specifically, enable you to do more in less time. Kind of our uber goal is, if we try to put it into a firm goal, is try to reduce the number of lines of code you need to write, or specifically the amount of time it takes for your app to start from beginning to end by about 2/3 between ASP.NET V1 and the Whidbey release in V2. It's a fairly ambitious goal. Does anyone believe me in the audience? Yeah, no one ever does at the beginning of the talk. Sounds a little fanciful. Basically, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk specifically talking about how we do it, and hopefully at the end, take that poll of hands. Most people end up hopefully leaving convinced. We're also, in terms of developer productivity, trying to enable scenarios that just aren't possible today. Rich personalization scenarios, rich role management scenarios with navigation. Things that maybe you could do today if you had enough time, but frankly, no one has enough time to add everything into their application. We're trying to make this much easier in Whidbey and enable kind of a much richer application as a result. We're focusing a lot of effort on administration and management. Specifically, we're trying to make sure that administrators love ASP.NET as much as hopefully developers do today. So you're going to see a lot of effort in terms of health monitoring support. So we can automatically detect when failures are occurring in your application, automatically notify administrators. You're going to see rich configuration APIs, so that now instead of always having to manually touch your web.config files or your config files on your system, you can programmatically update all those settings. And we're building a variety of rich administration tools so that you don't even have to use APIs. You can instead go ahead to the ISMC and now configure everything that lives inside your config system. We're spending a lot of time focusing on extensibility. So in other words, these first two bullet points are great in the sense that, yeah, we want to make sure you write less code, and we want to make sure it out of the box it's easy to administer. But one of the things that we've found when we talk to customers over and over again is while out of the box we can enable about 90–95% of the scenarios, one of the key things that people care about is the fact that it integrates with what they already have, or it integrates within their existing enterprise that has its own set of requirements. And so one of the things that we're really trying to make sure we do is that for all the features that we introduce, they work great out of the box, but they also have rich extensibility hooks so that you can integrate them into, for example, your own existing role management system or your own existing personalization store. And you can take advantage of all this functionality without having to completely change your deployment topology or your existing code base. And then last but not least, in terms of themes, we're focusing a lot on performance and scalability. We think with ASP.NET V1 today, we like to claim the world's fastest app server. We're trying to make it a lot faster in Whidbey. You're going to see a lot of emphasis on 64-bit support. You can now take an existing ASP.NET application that's running on a 32-bit server, copy it onto a 64-bit server, and it'll just work. And you can take advantage of a 64-bit processor now. We're also doing a lot of work that I'll be talking about and demoing a little bit later in terms of integrating our output caching support with a back-end database. So you can now go ahead and output cache content on your middle tier or just cache live data objects and have them automatically be invalidated when the underlying tables change in the database. The end result is you can build much, much faster applications. So before we, there's enough overview slides, just want to quickly drill into a simple demo before we write code of kind of what I consider a semi-canonical application out there today. It's your fairly simple internet content site. And people have probably seen ones like this or built one of them their own. So what this site is, it's, you can see it's my internet site. I have some content on the home page here, some static HTML, some data-bound articles and links on the home page. I have kind of a navigation system here so I can browse off across the site. You'll notice all the pages have a consistent header, consistent navigation system on the left-hand side. I can see a data-bound list of articles and drill into specific ones of different layouts. I've got the canonical ad rotator here on the left-hand side. It's automatically counting click-throughs and impression tracking when people visit the site. I've got a nice little breadcrumb UI on the top right so I can navigate up and down the hierarchy in an easy way. If I want to go to part of the site like the picture gallery, it's password protected so I can't by default get access to it. I can though go ahead and let's say register a new account. Type in some password. My favorite pet name. I have boring pets. Anyway, I can register my name on the site. You notice in the top right now it lists who I am. I can change my profile a little bit, and now I have access to, simple photo album gallery where I can drill into pictures about a meeting or whatnot. At the back end, we're logging everything that the user is doing so that an administrator can pull up reports to see kind of what's the usage pattern as people are going through the site, who's visiting what, and what are they doing. So not a very rich application or a very sophisticated application, but kind of a fairly common type of pattern that you probably see on the web today. How many people built an app somewhat similar to this? Yeah, has some forms of authentication going on, logging, ad rotation, common layout, navigation, etc. If you had to take a rough guess, how many lines of code do you think you'd need to build this with ASP.NET V1 today? Someone call something out. 500 lines. Do I have 1,000? 10,000 lines? Okay. 350 lines, okay. Probably if you're going to build like a real membership system with security and stuff, it's going to end up being at least several hundred lines of code, if not a couple thousand, if you really build your membership system correctly. The nice thing is, with Whidbey, this particular app's about 25 lines of code total. Yeah. I said with 25% code reduction. Someone here was saying 50, trying to put me on the spot. I'm about there, with even with 50 lines of code, if you could do it with V1. So let's talk about how. Seems a little fanciful. How can you do all this stuff with 25 lines of code? Well, the way we think we've got kind of this code reduction has been by working very closely with developers and looking at what are the types of apps that people build over and over again. So I asked at the beginning, how many people have built like their own forms of authentication system from the web today, and I saw a number of hands go up. Standard thing to build, save usernames and passwords, hopefully you're hashing them in a one-way fashion, locking users out, have that support. You can see who's online and when they were online, have a question-answer retrieval system. Those are the types of things you'd build with a membership system. And today you have to build it over and over again. One of the things that we're doing in Whidbey is introducing a built-in, what we call building block API called membership, which does all that for you. And so now within your app, if you want to create a user, you can just say membership.createUser, and it'll go ahead and manage it. If you want to validate them in order to log them in, you can just say membership.validateUser. Just a new API you can take advantage of out of the box. We're providing new role management APIs, so you can group users into logical roles and basically control security access based on that. We're providing a new personalization API. So if I want to go ahead and store properties about an individual user, I can go ahead and define them with our profile store. We'll then automatically have a strongly typed personal or profile object that you can take advantage of, where you can basically automatically set and retrieve those properties programmatically within code. We'll automatically handle the data storage back and forth to a back-end data store in order to retrieve and set those and do it in a very efficient way. We're providing new site navigation APIs so you can lay out a logical site map of your web. In other words, the hierarchy structure of the links within it. And then you can programmatically get access to figure out, oh, the user's hitting this particular, like for example, the articles page, and that's underneath the home page, and I have 3 child links for each individual page within my site. So you can now easily figure out where am I and what's the peer relationship of the other links around me. As I mentioned earlier, we're introducing database caching support. So I can now go ahead and stick anything I want inside the ASP.NET cache, whether it's content or it's a business object or a data object. And I can now say it depends on an underlying row or an underlying table inside a database. And ASP.NET will then automatically talk to the database. If at any point that data gets invalidated, ASP.NET will automatically invalidate its cache. And last but not least, and there's many more, but these are some of just the highlights, we're introducing rich management APIs. Specifically, we're introducing support for programmatically manipulating configuration. I can now go ahead and say, get me the configuration for a particular URL. I can set any properties I want in either a strongly typed or a late-bound fashion. Say update, and ASP.NET will automatically update the appropriate config sections and the appropriate config files on your system. So it's still being stored in web.config files, so you can still use Notepad or any other XML editor you want in order to edit it, but you also now have a programmatic way that you can do it as well. On top of this, we then have a rich MMC admin tool that I can control the version, and it's integrated within IIS, so I can just pull it up. And every single section inside the web.config file is now represented within that. So for example, if I want to change the membership provider, I can just open the tool up, change the drop down, hit apply, and away I go. I could also then, obviously, under the covers, that's going to use the config API. And again, under the covers, that's then going to go ahead and store it inside the web.config file. Other things we're doing in terms of health management, we're also now instrumenting code so that any time an unhandled exception occurs within your app, we'll automatically trap it, and we can route it to various notification queues. So one of the things that we provide in the box is, for example, email notification to administrators, where we'll send them the stack trace. We'll say, here's the page that caused the problem. Here's the incoming browser request that caused the issue. And we can set it up so that rather than get spammed thousands of times a minute when your database goes down, you can say, only send me a unique exception every hour or every 10 minutes or whatever time interval you want. But we'll automatically tell you what that problem is. You can also take advantage of that support and integrate it into existing operations environments as well. So all these features are, and there's many more, are kind of what we call building block services. And the idea is they just work out of the box. You don't need to configure anything special. You don't need to write any data access logic. We have all the table structures built in to the box in order to make it work. One of the things, though, that you might worry about when you see all those APIs is, okay, it's great if you have a membership store that just works for me. But what happens if I don't want your table schema? Or what happens if I really want my membership system to integrate with an existing LDAP server that my company has? Does this mean that none of these features can be used? And the answer to that is no, they absolutely can be used. And the way we enable that is by introducing, under all these APIs, what we call a provider model. And the idea with a provider model is we basically abstract out what all the storage mechanisms and all the back-end integration capabilities of these APIs into what we call provider classes. And there's a standard contract. It's either interface or abstract base class that you can go ahead and implement if you want to plug in your own underlying data store for any of these APIs. So all you need to do is implement, so for example, the iMembership provider interface, update the config file, and now anytime we call to the membership system throughout any of our APIs or throughout any of our admin tools, we'll automatically delegate to your provider. And what that means is you can basically integrate all these APIs both with the built-in Windows services that ship in the box, things like Auth Z-Man for role management. You can point them at SQL databases. You can point them at, for example, even Jet Access databases. We ship a test server in the box for that. And then again, you can also integrate it with your own existing stores, whether that's Oracle, whether that's an LDAP system, you name it. You have the total control for extensibility in order to take advantage of that. This is true, this provider model is true not just for the new APIs that we're shipping, like I mentioned on that previous slide, but also for existing APIs that we've shipped like Session State. And we've even gone so far as to provide a provider level model for our file system. So anytime we access the file system, you can actually intercept it and route it to something else. So for example, if you want to run your site out of a database, you now have that flexibility. On top of these building block APIs, we're then adding a number of features in what we call a page framework level. These are specific UI features. All these building block APIs before are not really UI based, they're more programmatic in terms of functionality. So specifically, some of the things that we're introducing are what we call master page support. So you can now do kind of visual page inheritance, where you can define a master template that controls the structure and overall UI design of your page, and you can go ahead and override it on a subpage level. We're introducing a new feature we call themes and skins, which allow you to sort of externalize a look and feel for a control. You can dynamically then set it based on, for example, let's say the personalization data that the user specifies, and control the look and feel of your site. And then another important one that we're adding, it gets even more important in the Longhorn time frame, is something we call adaptive UI. And the idea here is that for each of our controls that we ship in the box, there's an extensibility point that we call adapters, where you can go ahead and override the default rendering of that control, as well as how it handles the post-back and interactions with the client. Within the Whidbey time frame, we're building a suite of what we call mobile adapters for all the standard ASP.NET controls that ship in the box. So for example, if I use ASP text box or ASP calendar or ASP data grid on my page, and I hit it with, say, for example, like a WAP WML device or a Docomo iMode phone in Japan that handles CHTML, we can automatically render a non-HTML markup format down to that device, and the page will still work. Now, our expectation isn't that, magically you can have a page that looks great in a 19-inch browser look great on a 5-line cell phone. There's still limitations in terms of how much you can adapt. But the nice thing is it gives you a model where you can have a consistent programming model with one set of controls to understand, one set of objects, or one set of properties and methods to understand, and you can now go ahead and target different types of devices from within your server. So this is in the Whidbey time frame. In the Longhorn time frame, one of the things that we're looking at is how do we build a set of adapters that can target Longhorn specifically. And so, for example, we could have our controls, specifically some of our richer controls like grids and et cetera, go ahead and output XAML-specific controls that take advantage of Avalon. On top of all these APIs then, we're introducing approximately 45 new server controls in the Whidbey time frame that you can take advantage of without having to write procedural code, and that are built on top of all these APIs that I've listed below. So things, for example, like what we call login controls that handle things like logging people in, changing passwords, recovering passwords, et cetera. We now have a suite of those that, under the covers, just talk to the membership and role management APIs underneath. The nice thing is if you build an adapter or a provider that plugs in and replaces our membership system, these controls will then in turn delegate down to there as well. We're introducing a whole bunch more data controls to make data access much easier, both for binding directly to databases as well as specifically binding to a middle tier business object layer. We're introducing navigation controls, things like tree views, menus, breadcrumb controls that enable you to build navigation across a site much easier. And last, but probably from a usage perspective, most spectacularly, we're introducing what we call web parts directly into ASP.NET. Web parts has shipped about a week ago as part of Windows SharePoint Services and SharePoint Portal Server as part of Office 11. They're currently built on top of ASP.NET, and they're a special base class that ships as part of Office. What we're doing in the Whidbey time frame is taking that notion of web parts and baking it directly into ASP.NET. And so you can take advantage of this type of functionality from within any application, within any web application. And any control that you build in ASP.NET is also now automatically a web part that you can take advantage of in a portal environment. So, lots and lots of features. Last sort of big architectural thing I just want to mention is that's kind of different in terms of what you might expect, is that all these features work both for HTTP applications targeting browsers, as well as for applications that might or might not be running under HTTP that project using or that expose web services. And specifically, one of the things that we're doing in Whidbey is enabling Indigo to run inside ASP.NET. And ASP.NET will probably be the primary server host for Indigo. And it basically enables you to have a single app domain, a single application that takes advantage of all these core building block services that I mentioned before and provides a great way you can go ahead and expose web services. We support, again, also activation over HTTP. And because Indigo supports activation, for example, over TCP, we can also integrate that as well. And basically, the way it works is if you know the IIS stack, there's an HTTP sys listener. We have a process host manager that provides the worker process. And when an HTTP request comes in, we basically route that HTTP request through a specific HTTP protocol stack and then through the HTTP pipeline into an ASP.NET page. What we're doing in the Whidbey time frame is enabling activation over, for example, like a TCP message using Indigo. we'll run it through the Indigo message routing stack into an endpoint service running inside our application domain. All those services on the right-hand side, things like membership, configuration, caching, role management, and some state management services can be available from within both endpoints within that application, again, regardless of whether or not it's HTTP or not. And what we think this gives us is a great model, both for within you can build generic server apps, again, both browser and service-based. It also, going forward, gives us a much richer way that we can talk to rich clients like Avalon and Longhorn, because now I can have a single server app. It's capable of projecting both the browsers as well as having a direct communication channel to the client. So that's a quick overview of stuff that's in ASP.NET, the runtime. What I'm going to do is spend a few minutes talking also about Visual Studio, the tool, and then I'm going to basically spend the rest of the time writing a lot of code using both of them. So it's a lot of hands in terms of people using Visual Studio today. How do you like it for web development? Okay, good. Okay. Very vocal person in the front. A lot of people seem to like it, which is excellent. There's a few people that are saying, oh, I wish I had this feature or that feature. We've done a pretty major update of Visual Studio and Whidbey. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of those right now. We no longer require front-page server extensions. You can now edit webs directly off the file system. You can directly iterate through IIS to open any web. No front-page server extensions required. We now support FTP, as well as obviously front-page server extensions. And we're also investigating possibly adding DAV support. We now have a directory-based project system, which means that we actually no longer have project files. And what this means is you can basically edit any web anywhere. Point in a directory, you're good to go. Among other things, this gives us dramatic performance improvements. Not in the alpha, but in the beta. One of our benchmarks is opening the iBuySpy portal app on a 128 meg memory machine. We've seen performance in terms of opening the project drop from 62 seconds to 3.7 seconds. So hopefully your editing experience gets a lot faster. We no longer require that you compile the entire site into a single DLL, which is great for multi-team development. It's also great if you just want to go ahead and make a quick update to one of 1,000 files in your app and not have to recompile all 1,000 files. So much faster, we think much more seamless development. We now have HTML source preservation, which means that the tool will never reformat your HTML. I'm not claiming that as a feature. Let's just say that's an improvement. Various people say, God, you can't claim that as a feature. Maybe it's a bug fix. It actually involved a heck of a lot of work, but now you have an editor and a designer that you can trust. We also now have very flexible support for how you want your HTML to be formatted. So this is, for example, if I'm adding new controls or adding new HTML into my WYSIWYG design surface, or say, for example, I'm importing HTML from a buddy of mine that has slightly different standards, ideas in terms of indenting style than I like, you can now, within Visual Studio, exactly control the casing semantics, the XHTML compliant semantics, as well as the indentation semantics of what your tags look like. You can do that both at a general level for both server tags as well as client tags. And on a per tag level, for example, I could say the button tag has an end tag, or I could say, no, actually make it self-terminating. Every time now we add new markup into the designer, whether it's drag or drop, we'll follow those guidelines. You can highlight any text, right-click, and apply any of these custom formatting rules for you. You can also import and export all of these settings so you can use them in a team environment. We now have IntelliSense everywhere. This includes not just code behind, but also inline code, so you can do single file pages if you so choose. It applies to CSS, so you can go ahead and edit CSS styles inline within a tag, and you'll get full completion. Page directives and web.config files. So you get basically, any XML file with a DTD or XML schema. And JS files. We also then have a number of new things that we're adding in the source editing experience. So someone said, make the source editor richer. We're trying to make it much easier to navigate deeply nested HTML structures and just regular, complex HTML documents. One of those features is what we call a tag navigator. So you notice in the bottom right there, I can go ahead and, as I'm cursoring around in the file, we'll show you the full hierarchy from where you are in the cursor location to the HTML root in terms of tags. You can click on any of those tags to quickly navigate up and down through the source editor. We have what we call tag outlining. So at any tag level in the HTML document, you can go ahead and expand, collapse it in order to see kind of visually where you are within the document and what your nested structure looks like. We now have full XHTML support. So all the markup that we generate in the designer is XHTML compliant. We also have what we call a validation engine. And this validation engine works not just for XHTML, it also lets me target any other browser or any standard device. And we'll do real-time validation as you type. So for example, I can go ahead and say I want to target IE6, or no, actually, let's target XHTML 1.0 transitional. And as I'm typing, you'll see we'll get squigglies for any errors. We'll also show up in the task list anything that doesn't conform to that schema that we're targeting. So it gives you an easy way. You can say, will this work with Opera? Will this work with Netscape? Will this work with IE? And the tool will give you, real-time intelligence as you're going to see how whether or not you'll succeed. In terms of compliance, we're also building in a Section 508 as well as a WCAG accessibility checker in the tool. What this means is if you're targeting, for example, like a government app, or you have corporate guidelines which say your site must be accessible, for example, to people with site problems, you can very easily within the IDE now, either as part of your build process or just on an individual page level, check for compliance, and basically will show in your task list any problems that you might have with your source that need to be fixed. Much richer HTML designer enhancements. So as I mentioned, we always generate XHTML source. We also now always generate CSS instead of always inlining your styles. Much richer table editing and creation, resizing, etc. We have much richer support, or rich support for what we call master page design time. And I'm going to be building this a little bit later. The idea with master pages, as I mentioned earlier, is I can define a page master, define replaceable regions within it, and then within my design time experience, we'll actually gray out everything within the master, only let people edit those regions that are actually replaceable. Gives you a much richer experience, and in a great way you can go ahead and integrate a consistent look and feel across your site. We have much richer code behind editing support. We're going to a new model where we use partial types, which really reduces the brittleness that we sometimes run into with code behind today. For example, a situation where your tool might not be able to open the file or might change the code behind the file in such a way that it's no longer easy to open. That's taken care of. It's also much more object-oriented and much faster. Again, as I also mentioned, as an option, we still support, or we're adding support for what we call single-file page editing. We still recommend code behind as the preferred way when you're building applications. For people that prefer single-page editing, we now have rich support in terms of full IntelliSense and debugging for that. We now have a built-in ASP.NET web server inside Visual Studio. So if you don't have IIS installed on your local production or local development machine, or you don't, for some reason have a requirement that you're not allowed to install it, let's say for security permissions, or you have a requirement that your developers can't run as admin on the local box, you now have a way you can go ahead and build your apps regardless. Basically, it's a simple web server. It's designed for development, not for production. For security reasons, it only allows requests from the local client. When you shut down the IDE, we automatically shut it down on the web server as well. So it's a great way you can basically build apps without requiring IIS on the box. For situations where you're deploying apps to a remote system, we have a new feature we call Publish Web. The way Publish Web works is I can basically use it to synchronize files between my local project as well as my remote server. And so basically I can pop this up as a tool window so I can keep it open with the other documents on my system. I can connect to that remote system using FTP, front page server extensions, a file share, and as I mentioned, we're probably going to add DAV support. About 70% sure we're going to add DAV support. What this will show you is basically what's the latest version of my documents in my project versus on my server. You'll notice some arrows on the left-hand side. Those weren't drawn in by me. That's actually the tool pointing out that there's newer documents on the left-hand side that haven't been copied on the right. So we'll tell you which is more up to date on each side. And yes, it does work across different time zones. So if your server's co-located in a different place, it'll work as well. You can then hit the right arrow to sync the files across. You can hit the back arrow to sync them back. And then you can use the back and forth arrow, and that'll make sure that the most recent version lives on both places. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we have a full log file support. So as you're copying things back and forth, or a couple hours later you're trying to figure out, oh, did Joe copy this or did I copy this file? You can pull up your log and see exactly what you did on your system. Much richer data design time support, as well as a whole bunch of richer runtime support that we're adding for data access inside ASP.NET Whidbey. We now have a WYSIWYG data access layer designer. This isn't in the alpha bits that you're getting this week, but it'll be showing up in the beta time frame. What this is going to let you do is model classes as well as tables as well as stored procedures as components that you can drag and drop onto a design surface. We'll then automatically generate classes that you can program against. You can construct custom queries, etc. So it makes it much easier to build a data access layer. The other thing that we're doing from a runtime perspective is then enabling you to bind not only against your data access layer, but also against a business object layer that can wrap the data access capability. And so hopefully the end result is you can build your applications with Visual Studio much, much faster, much, much cleaner, and a much more web-friendly environment. So, too many PowerPoints. Let's go ahead and write some code. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is switch back to our demo laptop here. And go ahead and build a new Whidbey project, or website. Actually, I just did something too quick. Let me just show off here. I'm going to do File, Open Website. One of the things you'll notice is my Open Website dialog, I now have multiple options for how I can connect to a website. So for example, I can directly iterate through IIS. I can even go so far as to create new vroutes directly within the IDE. This, again, does not require front-page server extensions in the box in order to enable this. I can also then browse directly against the file system. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. Anyone prompt me with a name for what we want to call this project? Beer? Why not? So we're going to call this the Beer Project, and we'll put it on C:"beer and open it up. Now, one thing I will just want to show is what does the beer directory look like? You'll notice there's nothing in it right now. This goes back to the sort of open any web, anywhere. We don't need a project file. We don't need a solution. We can basically point at a directory, and away we go. And we also no longer generate a whole bunch of superfluous files that we add into your project without you wanting it. We only add files in the project when you explicitly ask us to. Again, something that's questionable as a feature maybe is sort of a nice bug fix. Anyway, so let's go ahead and build a page. I'm going to call this page Data Page 1. We're going to do some simple data access with it. You'll notice, again, the HTML is much cleaner than what you're probably used to. There's no meta tags. There's no schema files. We're trying to have the HTML look exactly the way you'd write it yourself by hand. So the first sort of scenario I want to walk through is a simple sort of data access scenario. So if I said to someone, hey, come up on stage with Everett, build me a page that it goes against a database and does paging, sorting, editing, deleting, selection, and filtering. Could you do it from scratch with 1,000 people watching you? Anyone bold enough to say they could? There's usually one in the audience that says so. I'm not going to try it. What instead I'm going to show you is what that experience is like with Whidbey. So we're going to call this the author data page. To begin with, I'm going to go ahead and add the authors table onto my page. So I'm going to go into the Data Explorer here, drag and drop it. It's going to go ahead and generate the grid for me that's data bound to that data source. If I go ahead and hit run now, you're going to see that my web server, built-in web server, is going to start up because I haven't set up an IIS route for this application yet. Hopefully my database is kicking in. Now I have a simple grid that's bound to that page. If you look at our code behind here, you'll notice I didn't have to write any code, and in fact the tool didn't write anything for me. Instead, our data controls are now smart enough that we can bind to a variety of different data sources, including one that we call a SQL data source that I have down here. If I want to go ahead and enable paging and editing support, I could do so by clicking paging and sorting support to begin with. We'll click paging and sorting, go back to our page here, hit refresh, and now I have a pageable, sortable grid. Again, I didn't have to write any code. The tool didn't write any code for me. Instead, the data control is now smart enough directly to handle the paging and sorting semantics internally. I want to add some filtering support. So for example, let's have support where I can say enter a state, and I'll have a nice little drop-down list here. Could data bind it, or I'm just going to go ahead and throw in a few values. We're in California, came from Washington, and we'll put in Kansas. For some reason I have rows from Kansas in my database as well. I'm going to set this to be auto post back, so it's going to go back to the server when I change it so I can do an update. What I want to go ahead and do is modify this grid so I automatically filter the values based on what's selected in the drop-down list. I could write some code to do this, or I could take advantage of a new feature that we have in Whidbey, which allows me to go ahead and bind declarative fields directly without having to write code. So for example, I could go ahead here and add a query called where state is equal to a parameter. I could specify I want to bind this parameter directly against a control. I could also pull this parameter from a query string. We'll do all of the SQL encoding as well as HTML encoding, so you don't have to worry about injection attacks. In this case here, I'm just going to say bind it to a control, bind it to that drop-down list. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this page. I'm filtered automatically based on that. If I had enough values, it would support paging, and I can basically iterate through my data in a pretty easy, clean way. If I want to go ahead and enable updating, I could go ahead and click the Enable Editing Support. And now, for example, if I go to Washington, Oakland really isn't in Washington, it's in California. I click the Update button, and it automatically updated the database. Again, I didn't have to write any code. Instead, the code behind is still empty. What's happening is the grid is talking to this SQL data source control. So we look at the source for this page, you'll see what's happening. So there's my drop-down list. There's my grid view. And there's just some bound columns with the schema information. I have allow paging, allow sorting, allow editing as true values for properties. And then I have the SQL data source. And this is what's encapsulating my data access right now. And this is the new data control that if I want to do two-tier data binding within my page, that I can go ahead and use to directly bind against the database. And it in turn encapsulates all the queries necessary to grab the data and get it back out. Now, it's kind of good for reporting scenarios, but I know a number of you are saying, well, gosh, it's not really enterprise ready. I want to have a nice middle tier object that encapsulates my data access, and that's really what I want to bind against. I don't want to have this data code running inside my page. Don't worry. For people, basically, our data controls architecture doesn't require two-tier data binding. To the contrary, we actually have great support for what we call object data binding, where we're actually binding not directly against the database using a SQL data source, but binding against either a middle tier object layer or even a web service layer using what we call the object data source. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is build this page now. Again, I'm going to call it data page 2 this time. We're going to copy just the drop-down list and the heading here. I'm going to call it with middle tier. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and copy in an existing data access layer and business access layer that I built a little bit earlier. We'll walk through that in just a second. So basically what I've just copied into my project, and you notice I didn't need to add any files. I could just copy it into the directory, and automatically it shows up. I don't need to explicitly add into a project. But what I've copied into here is two files. One is a file called authorsdb, which is sort of a data access layer that's just calling ADO.NET and returning data sets, as well as having an update method which will update the database. And then what I've copied into here is a business access layer, where I have an author class, which is just a standard class with a couple of properties. So for example, I have an author constructor, individual properties for there, no data access whatsoever. Then I have a publisher class. And what this publisher class does is it has two methods. One for looking up the authors by estate. It's just calling into the data access layer, getting back a data set, and then it's basically creating a generic list. So for example, right here you can see it's using generics, and it's saying this is a strongly typed list of type author, and it's just populating that and returning it. Then I have an update method which updates the author as well. So what I want to go ahead and do is take this grid, or put a grid onto this page and bind it against this middle tier object layer. And I want to do it as easily and as simply as possible. So to do that, all I'm going to go ahead and do is drag and drop my grid view onto the page. I'm going to say connect to data source. I could connect to that SQL data source that we saw before, but instead I'm going to connect to this object data source, which encapsulates talking to a middle tier object layer. Still going to enable paging and sorting. And hit save. I'm going to go to this object data source, and we'll have design time for this. Brad is going to show it in his data talk, but for right now I actually need to go ahead here and manually update the property grid. I'm going to point this object data source to bind against my publisher business layer, and I want to have get authors by state or look up authors by state be the method that I'm going to call for fetching data, and I'm going to have the update author be the method I'm going to call for updating data on that business logic. And then last but not least, because that method has a parameter, I'm going to go ahead and set up a parameter association just like I did before with the SQL data source, where I can bind it against a variety of different places, including, oops, not cookie control, including against that drop-down list. And just to make it a little bit more attractive, let's go ahead and format it. Hit save, hit run. Now what you're seeing is basically me binding a grid against that middle tier object. That middle tier object is now connecting to the database through a data access layer, getting the data, constructing a generic collection of author objects, and that's what this grid is now binding against. And so if I go ahead and change any value here, you can see we're still doing filtering. I can do sorting and paging. I can even go ahead now and enable editing support. I have a nice little edit button here. Let's move Mike to Washington. Hit update. And there he is. And so basically now I have rich data controls. Right now it's a grid. I could just as easily bind it to a data list or any other type of richer HTML-based control, bound to a middle tier business object layer, going through a data access layer. I didn't need to write a lot of code. And the nice thing is from my UI presentation layer perspective, I don't need to actually inject a whole bunch of data access code or even procedural logic. We can declaratively bind those up. So I'm going to hold answers until the end, but I'll definitely get to your question. So hopefully you can see data access gets a lot easier with Whidbey. Now one of the questions, of course, you might be asking is, okay, if everyone starts throwing things at our database performance is going to start going down. Everyone's going to be able to build data pages from now on. Now today, one way to mitigate that is to take advantage of output caching. So how many people use output caching today with ASP.NET V1? More of you should. It's a pretty cool feature. Basically, the way it works is, let's just build a page called cache test to illustrate this. Basically, the way it works is I'm going to throw in a label here, bump up the font size, and it's just the time. I'm just going to drag the authors table on here. I can go ahead and update a timestamp just to illustrate what's happening under the covers. So basically, I'm running this cache test page. It's binding to a grid. Every time I hit the page now, you'll notice the timestamp's being updated with the current timestamp that was used when the page was generated. So right now, every single time we hit the page, the timestamp gets updated. So with output caching in V1, what I could go ahead and do is add an output cache directive to the top of the page. You'll notice in Whidbey we now have IntelliSense for all the directives. And what I'm doing here is basically saying, rather than regenerate this page on each request, only regenerate every 5 seconds. And now when I go and hit the page during that 5-second interval, I'm sending back the same cached HTML output. And every 5 seconds it'll go ahead and update. And the great benefit there is regardless if I have, say, 10,000 clients hitting my site, only every 5 seconds do I end up regenerating this page. So the one limitation that we had with output caching, or issue you could see with output caching in V1, is that the way that you invalidate items is typically using a timer. So in other words, I say output cache this thing for a certain number of seconds, and then that's kind of the way I basically invalidate things. It's typically time duration. And we had file system change notifications as well, but the main way that people did it was with timers. And the issue you might have is, for example, when you have a page that's backed against data, whether it's this or a much richer portal page, you might get into a situation where you're worried about projecting stale data on that page down to your clients. So for example, if this is price-sensitive information, 5 seconds is probably okay for it to be stale, but I certainly don't want it to be 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days. And what that ended up meaning was you limited the amount of stuff that you output cached and specifically the duration that you cached it for. What we're adding in Whidbey is direct support so that instead of always just purely making it timer driven, I can also go ahead and say it's based on a database dependency. So for example, I'm going to say this is actually based on the pub's authors table, and it has a much, 55,000 second duration. What ASP.NET will then do when you actually go ahead and execute this page is dynamically wire up a connection to SQL. It depends on the version. We'll either go ahead and listen to a notification on SQL, or go ahead and check for when a database table changes. And basically during that interval of time, if the table in the database that we're watching actually changes, we'll automatically then invalidate this underlying page. And so now instead of waiting 55,000 seconds for this to be invalidated, if I just went ahead now and opened up the authors table, changed Dave to go to California. Actually, let's move him to Kansas. You notice here he is right here. It's Washington. Here's the timestamp. If I hit refresh, you notice the page detected that the underlying database changed, automatically invalidated that output cache entry. The next browser request re-executed the page, and the HTML sent down to the browser. What this means now is if you have a data-driven site with a lot of dynamic content, you can now basically output cache the heck out of it, both for portions of a page as well as for the entire page within the site. And a new feature that we're adding in Whidbey is what we call, blanking on the name, it's basically called the donut feature, where you can actually output cache everything but a small portion of the page. There's an advanced caching talk that Rob Howard's doing, I think on Wednesday, and it's repeated as well, that'll talk about all those things in more detail. So, cool. So, we're starting to build up a couple of different pages. We have 3 of them now on our site. And one of the downsides about this is, although I'm kind of keeping with a consistent look and feel, every one of them has a slightly different kind of style that I've come up with. And frankly, I'm not very good at style. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is there's no kind of common, consistent template that's actually driving me to adopt, a uniform design and layout on my site. And that's where this next feature comes in. That's called master pages. The idea with master pages, and we'll go ahead and build one right now. I'm going to call it Site Master. It works very much like a regular HTML page or a regular ASP.NET page in the sense that, I have an HTML body, form running equals server. The one difference is I have a master directive instead of a regular page directive. And within this HTML page, I can go ahead and add any standard HTML I want. So for example, here I'm going to go ahead and add a blue table at the top that I'm going to use as kind of a consistent header for my site. I'm going to add some images into our beer directory. Thank you very much for that back there. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll just add, say, our logo and kind of a standard header that I want on all my pages on my site. Then I'm going to go ahead and add another table that I'm going to use to kind of control the layout structure. And what I want to do is have this be kind of a menu and this actually be the content. And so we'll just go ahead and make a few small sizing adjustments. And again, we'll come back to this, but we're going to add a menu to it or a tree view to it at a later date. I want to have this right-hand side be, where each of the pages on the site actually fills in its content. So to do that on a master page, I can take advantage of one of our new controls in Whidbey called the content placeholder control. What this does is I can drag and drop it onto the page, and it basically identifies a region that I want to enable pages on the site to override or fill in. I can give this control any ID that I want, so I can have any number of controls on the page that I want. So I'm just going to call this main body. And now when I go ahead and build new pages, I can say that I want to go ahead and we'll just create one called default.aspx. I can say I want to base it on top of the site master. What Visual Studio will then do at design time is automatically pick out what the master template looks like and gray it out on this content page and only allow me to edit that portion of the page that the master page is defined to be editable. So for example, this content region right here. And I could change this to be welcome to my demo. Let's say, whoops. And we'll just highlight it here. At the source level, you'll notice we just have an ASP content tag, so we're only saving in the actual page itself the region that's been changed. Everything else lives in the master. The nice benefit about this is I can update the master in one location. All the pages on the site will immediately take effect. At runtime, ASP.NET is then going to go ahead and merge the two together into a single HTML page that's sent down to the browser. And so it's a very easy way. I can now go ahead and build multiple sort of content pages throughout my site that are based on top of this layout. I can have any number of controls or code that I want both at the master as well as the content page level. And there's an object model, so if you optionally want to, you can have them talk between each other. So I have a page here now. Oh, thanks. Page here now with a common header. I have a to-do for a menu. Let's go back to that and fill that in. So I probably want to go ahead and have some kind of link structure on my site. Ideally, rather than hard-coding the links into this master page, I probably want to have kind of a nice, say, site navigation system out there that I can represent the overall hierarchy and relationship of links within my system. And I want to have some way to present it. What we have in Whidbey is a couple new controls. One of them is the tree view control. We're also going to have a menu control, which is going to be more applicable to this scenario. It's not in the alpha bits that you're having now, it's in the beta, so that's why I'm going to show it with the tree view, which is the bits that you do have. But basically what I can do is I can take this tree view, I can bind it against, for example, our new site navigation system. This is just a data source that encapsulates that. I could go ahead and, let's say, for example, expand the initial depth of our tree view and go ahead and make it look a little bit like the XP File Explorer. Now, to represent this site this sort of the site navigation structure of my site, I'm going to go ahead and copy in a sitemap file that I've defined before. And what the sitemap file is, it's just an XML file. We will have color coding in IntelliSense, but basically right now it's just defining the overall structure of the site. So I have a home link, I have a couple data samples, and I have kind of an other samples section down here as well. If I go ahead now and run this page, you'll see that the tree view has been populated on the left-hand side. It's driven against the site navigation system. If I go ahead and click on any of these links, we'll go ahead and navigate onto that particular page onto the site. Now, one problem right now with this demo is when I click on data page 2, you'll notice it's going to this data page, and this data page actually doesn't have the master template applied. And so we actually kind of have a slightly different look and feel. So you might ask, well, okay, how do I get this page to actually be based on the master template? Good news is it's not that hard. All you need to do is go back into this page here. I'm going to say, base this on this master. You'll notice that VS will automatically show IntelliSense for the masters that are in our project. I'm then going to go ahead and add content control on here. Again, you'll notice we provide IntelliSense based on what content placeholders are available in the master. I'm then going to go ahead and get rid of the HTML body. I don't need that anymore because the master page is going to define that. Add my close tag. You'll notice now at design time I get WYSIWYG. We go back and hit refresh now with this page in the browser. You'll see this is now integrated within my site. Now when I link back and forth between the home page, I'm integrated into a single consistent look and feel. Now last but not least, I might get lost in this site that right now only has 3 pages, but let's say I got lost in the site. I might want to have a breadcrumb control that helps me find my way back. That's a new control again we have in Whidbey. Oops, although I dragged and dropped the wrong one. Called the sitemap path. What this does, for example, when I go ahead and click on our data page, didn't put it in maybe the best place, but you can basically see that it's driving off of the site navigation system. It's seeing, oh, I'm in a section called data pages underneath the home, and it's basically just providing me link structure so I can navigate my way back. If I go ahead and update the sitemap file, and let's say, for example, I want to rename this link to be object data source. Hit save. I call this data samples new. You notice I just have to update that file in one location. A tree view automatically gets updated, as does the site breadcrumb control. And so it's a very easy way I can now move links around. I can completely restructure my site. I don't need to go ahead and update HTML in a whole bunch of pages. Instead, update it in one location. I can either programmatically get access to it, or as you can see, I can declaratively bind it. So, next thing is actually object data, since that wraps a little bit. So, starting to have the buildings of a site here. I have kind of consistent look and feel. I have some data. I have some navigation. It's time to add security, specifically login authentication access to the site. So, we'll make this an internet site, so I'm going to say this is going to have sort of a forms-based authentication model. As I mentioned earlier, we have now a membership and a role management system built into Whidbey. So if I want to store credentials in a secure way, I now have a way to do it. I can just say membership.createUser to create new accounts. We also have admin tools that enable us to do that. We automatically hash the passwords. We'll add a random salt per row so that it's not susceptible to dictionary attacks. We do things like lockout of users, recovering of passwords, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great API that I can take advantage of out of the covers. Again, we have the provider model underneath, though, so if you want to integrate that API to your existing credential store, you have that flexibility as well. To integrate it onto my site, I'm going to do a couple things. First, I'm going to need to add a login page. And I'm going to need to find some way to point to it on my site. So I'm going to go ahead and add a login link to my top right. Now, I could go ahead and write some code that identifies whether or not I'm logged in or logged out and provides the appropriate link. Or I could take advantage of one of our new login controls called login status. What this control is going to do is it's going to automatically detect, is the user authenticated on the site? If they're not, it's going to provide me with a login link. If I am logged in, it's going to prompt me to log out, and then we'll automatically unauthenticate them if they click it. We'll then go ahead and add a login page. We're going to call this login.aspx. We're going to base it on our site template master, so it's going to pick up the look and feel that the rest of our site has. And within this page, I could go ahead and obviously easily write some code that talks to the membership API, collects the username and password, checks to make sure it's true, and then logs them into the system. Now, the downside is I still have to write some code to do that. Or what I could go ahead and do is take advantage of another login control that we ship called ASP Login. And what this will do is under the covers, it basically provides all the UI I need in order to log in. You can see it's what it looks like. It's templatized, so if I want to precisely control the look and feel, it's very easy to go ahead and do that. What it's just been doing under the covers is validating the username and the password. I want to make sure they enter in the right stuff and is in the right format. It'll then call into the membership API, and if it correctly logs people in, it'll go ahead and authenticate them onto the system. And so now when I go ahead and run this site, I can click login, can enter in a username and password, click login. If I have it correct, you'll notice it sends me back. You notice that top right link now is called log out, and that's because basically we've identified that you're now authenticated onto the system. And now I have a simple way that I can log users in and out. Now, how do you know who the user is logged in as? And how do I know this is all real and not something I'm just making up? Well, it might be nice to actually personalize a little bit. So instead of saying welcome to my demo, maybe we want to say, hey, welcome Scott. So we could go ahead and obviously write some code to do that. We could use the user.identity.name property to figure out who the logged in user is and just sort of programmatically update a label. I can also take advantage of a new control that we ship in Whidbey called the login view control. And what the login view control does is it basically is a templatized control that allows me to construct a number of template views based on whether or not the user is logged in or logged out to the system. I can also go ahead and create customized views based on what role that user is logged in as. So for example, if you want to have some content on your site that only premium users can see, you can drop the login view control onto the page, create a template for it. In this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and create a template for the anonymous user, and then I'm just going to create another template for the logged in user. And so we'll just say welcome. I'm just going to throw in the login name control. Hit save. Now you'll notice I'm logged in, so it's going to go ahead and say welcome Scott GU. If I log out, you notice it basically unauthenticates me and shows me the anonymous template I went ahead and defined. So it's a very easy way you can go ahead now and have designers work on what the content of the site looks like depending on whether or not a user is logged in or not and depending on what role that they're in. And because we have the built-in role management service in the box in Whidbey, it becomes much easier to integrate that within your site. So we have kind of a basic site. We have navigation. We have security. We have some object data binding going on. The one downside, of course, is that the site doesn't look that attractive. It's somewhat bare basic there. I don't claim to be a UI designer, but the nice thing is I have one that works for me. And I can go ahead and take their hard work, where they've gone ahead and defined a nice CSS style sheet with some style information, as well as come up with a layout master page that takes advantage of that style information. And I can go ahead now as a developer and copy that, paste that into my project. Now when I go ahead and hit refresh in the browser, what you're seeing is the exact same, whoops. I'm trying to show that it's real. We're going to call this main content. And we're going to go ahead and update it in several places. And we're going to go ahead in the login page. I guess we've already created it there. Go ahead and hit refresh. And what you're seeing now is what this site looks like with a slightly different look and feel. Go ahead and update the default page as well. We'll see what it looks like there as well. Sorry about that. But you can now see basically what the look, how we've modified the look and feel simply by changing the master template. And this kind of shows off some of the power of the content and code separation that we now have in Whidbey, where in the master template I can define the overall style structure of the site, get something working as a developer, have a designer work on it, pass it in to my app, and then basically I can update it and have my site look better. And now I can go ahead and log in. You saw the breadcrumb control in action right there. You can see where we're welcome users in. You can see how we kind of have integrated some of these, all the code that I wrote basically onto this page. There isn't any other controls or any code on this master page that I'm showing right now that I didn't create on that kind of bare bones looking page a little bit earlier. So the last thing I want to go ahead and add to this site is a little bit more content. This home page is looking a little bare. I probably want to go ahead and have some real cool controls that are all data bound, going against web services or a database on my home page to kind of entice the user deeper into the site. I'd probably want to go ahead and build these, let's say, as user controls. And go ahead and copy a few user controls into my system. Copy and paste that as well so we can add them. And basically what I have is just some simple user controls that are providing some content on the site. Breaking news, market information, headlines, etc. I'm going to build another one as well that we'll add to it in just a second. But what I want to basically do is add these controls onto my main page. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and add some register directives that are just going to go ahead and import these controls into my page. To lay out these controls, previously I'd probably go ahead and have some tables and I'd have to worry about headers and columns and figure out kind of how do I get the consistent, clean look and feel across the site or across the page. Or I could take advantage of some new controls that we're adding in Whidbey called the web part zone controls. And I mentioned this at the very beginning as some of those 45 new controls that we're adding into the Whidbey timeframe. And what the zone controls do, you can see them declared here on the page, is they basically serve as a container control for nested controls within it. And what they'll go ahead and do within that page is basically provide a consistent look and feel around all those controls contained within it. So for example, we have a consistent header. There's a little close box and minimize box that we can put on the right-hand side. And I can update the style information for these controls in a fairly rich way. If I want to go ahead and build another control, to plug in here, all I need to do is say build user control. We're going to call it, let's say, the author control. Yeah, we'll just cheat and throw some data on here. Actually, let's grab a fewer columns. We could enable, let's say, paging and sorting. I'm going to shrink the font down just a little bit and change the style. And since we're going to have a lot of data on our page, I'm going to go ahead and change this to be page size of 5 instead of 10. So to add this onto our page now, I could go ahead and just like I did with those other controls, I could register this user control. I'm going to call it author. Oops. Author.ascx. And now down here, I'm going to say Scott Gu author. Call this author. Okay, now we go ahead and hit refresh here. What I'm going to see is simple grid inside this kind of nice consistent layout. Now, as an end user visiting this site, hey, it's nice I have some information that's dynamic on here. But what happens if I don't really want to see this author control? It's not very useful to me. Or potentially I don't want to see it at the top always on this page. Is there some way I can go ahead and delete it? Is there some way I can go ahead and move it around? And I kind of call that scenario personalization, where I can, as an end user, make this site infinitely more rich than maybe the original layout author in terms of where they position things intended to choose those. Today, doing that probably requires a couple thousand lines of code. If I want to handle some kind of JavaScript that lets people move things around, store it in some kind of personalization system, etc. With Whidbey, it's pretty easy. What I can go ahead and do is, as a page developer, decide that I want to make this page personalized. So I can say enable personalization equals true. I can then go ahead and, for example, in my site template, add some kind of UI. I'm just going to drop a link button here I call it personalize. And I'm going to go ahead and change the color to be white so it shows up a little bit better. And what I want to go ahead and do is enable the end user to basically click this personalize button and switch the page into a personalization mode. That enables them to move things around and customize it. Do that, I'm just going to go ahead as a developer, double click, and within my event handler I'm going to say page personalization. Whoops, dot. Set display mode. Oops. Hold on here. Set display mode. I'm going to switch this into what we call a catalog view on the page. Hit save. Go ahead and hit refresh on our page here. And now if I'm logged in, which I am as Scott GU, and I click that personalized link button, what you'll notice is I'm going back as an end user running in the browser. I'm seeing this page, and you notice that what ASP.NET's done is it's automatically, because of those web part zone controls, enabled regions that as an end user I can go ahead and customize. So for example, if I want breaking news not to be on this bottom here, but let's say for example on this top, I can drag and drop it. If I want to go ahead and move the current rate information above that author control, I can drag and drop it. If I want to get rid of this market statistics control, I can click close. You'll notice it's no longer on the page, but it is still in the catalog, so if I want to add it back, I could. When I go ahead and hit close, what's going to happen is that ASP.NET's going to look to see how did the end user customize this page. We're going to save all the personalization settings in terms of layout that the user specified, and we're going to write them into the new ASP.NET personalization store that comes in Whidbey. I could optionally augment that layout information with existing properties about the user, like their area, what they visited, who they are, what their gender is, etc. And the benefit is, because it's actually stored in the personalization system, if they go ahead and log out of this site now, you'll notice, because I'm no longer logged in, I'm getting the default look and feel that the page developer specified. If I close the browser down even or went to a different machine and then logged back in, what you'll see is I'm seeing the layout that I saved before as that individual personalized user. I get the exact same settings that I wanted, and that my experience on the site is much, much richer. And again, I could do this both on the local machine. I could just as easily log out, go to a completely different machine using a completely different browser, log back in, and all my settings are going to be restored. And these types of personalization scenarios, I wrote all the code that you need to see right here. It doesn't take much. And the end result kind of really dramatically improves the overall customer experience visiting your site. So I hope you've seen there's some pretty major advances coming in ASP.NET Whidbey. Key thing, everything we're doing is going to be 100% compatible with what you have today. So in other words, keep building those apps using the technology today. They're going to run even better in Whidbey. ASP.NET Whidbey will run on top of IS5, IS5.1, and IS6. It does not require an OS or an IS upgrade in order to deploy or run it. And so you can basically use your existing hardware, your existing operating systems, install the ASP.NET Whidbey runtime, and you'll be good to go. And hopefully, as you've seen kind of in the last hour or so, we're really doing a lot in terms of making both building and developing web applications, as well as the administration side and running them, a heck of a lot easier in Whidbey. And our hope is that you can develop applications, kind of the fraction of the time that it takes today, and more importantly, be able to spend time working on scenarios like personalization, like richer security, where you really add value to your application. So instead of spending your time always working on trying to get the basic stuff working, you can invest a lot more time in making your applications a lot richer. And again, everything that I built on stage here was built using the bits that you're getting today. I'll post the samples as well as all the code steps in order to build these on that website that I'm about to link to in just a second. And so the key sort of takeaway is, install the bits today. Love to have feedback. Hopefully you'll find it's a pretty fun set of technology. There are 18 ASP.NET talks going on at the PDC this week. I have a large list of them up here. We have great data controls talks, part 1 and part 2, that will go into much more detail than I showed, that Brad Millington's giving tomorrow. We have talks on master pages, themes, and the site navigation system that Andreas is giving. We're also then showing a web parts talk that's going to go into more detail with that page personalization that I showed at the end that he's giving as well. As part of the web parts talk, we're actually going to show a version of SharePoint, early prototype of SharePoint version 3.0 that's built on top of Whidbey. And one of the things that we're going to show is how the current web parts that ship as part of SharePoint can seamlessly be used inside Whidbey and will enable control-to-control connections between both a Whidbey and a SharePoint control that ships today. And so it shows how your investment going forward works great and how the interop is really going to hopefully be spectacular. We have a great talk on Visual Studio that's going to go on. I had a lot of screenshots when I talked about Visual Studio at the beginning. You're going to see those things live in terms of demo walkthroughs a little bit later this week. Much more details about membership, role management, personalization, and caching. One of the things that we're going to do as part of those talks is not just show the scenarios that I showed up here, but specifically drill into how do you build a provider for each of those individual services. So if you have an existing LDAP store, an existing credential store, an existing role management system, you're going to see, here's the APIs, here's the code sample for how I integrate these new APIs into that data store. Mobile development shows how you can go ahead and use Whidbey to target small form factors, things like cell phones, PDA devices, etc. It's going to talk a little bit about our adapter architecture that we're going to be using more and more going forward to target even richer clients. 2 talks on administration that Eric Olson's doing. One specifically on configuration and admin tools and the APIs to update kind of and deploy apps. The second one talking a lot about our tracing infrastructure and health monitoring infrastructure that I didn't get a chance to talk about much today. On Thursday, Shanku's going to do a great talk that specifically, I think it's called like Building Next Generation Web Services and ASP.NET Applications. Specifically going to cover how do you build Indigo web services inside ASP.NET, as well as how do you integrate those services with our built-in building block APIs like membership, role management, etc. And show some good code samples there. Nikhil's doing 2 great talks on Thursday, which is going to drill into a lot more depth about control designers, or building controls, both the runtime and the design time aspect. He's going to show building a text editor control. One of the neat things about it is it's going to show one of the new features I didn't get a chance to talk about, which is called out-of-bound postbacks, or out-of-bound callbacks in ASP.NET Whidbey, where a control in the browser can talk to the server without doing a callback, or without doing a postback, which causes a complete page to refresh. I think he's showing like a spell checker using a control running in the browser. He's also going to show some blog controls in the second part of this talk, which are built on top of that text editor. I'm then doing a cool tips and tricks talk on Wednesday. The tips and tricks talk I should mention up front is not going to show any demo or any tip or any feature that's covered anywhere else in any of the other talks. So it's kind of a cool collection of stuff that isn't covered elsewhere. And then on Thursday we have a great ASP.NET panel with a number of members of the ASP.NET team where we can basically answer any questions you have. To learn more about Whidbey, we also have 2 books out at the PDC specifically dedicated to ASP.NET Whidbey. One is from Addison Wesley, which is the screenshot I have here. Another one is from A-Press. Unfortunately, I don't have a screenshot there. But they're each between about 500 or 300 and 500 pages in terms of overall content. They're all built using the bits that you're getting today. And so it's a great place. There's only about 500 copies of each at the bookstore right now. So run out and go buy it before it disappears. If it is gone from the bookstore, you can go to either the Addison Wesley or the A-Press stand, and they're also selling copies there. Or you can go ahead and buy it from Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. It'll probably also show up in some local bookstores at some point soon. This is a great book great books to basically take away, and you can use them to help guide you through Whidbey and the bits that you have. We have great hands-on labs. I think we have about 14 hours worth that are available that you can go ahead and walk through in your copious spare time here at the PDC this week. One other nice thing is that they are also online. So if you don't get a chance to walk through all 14 hours, you can actually download them from this URL right here, www.asp.net/Whidbey, which is also where all the slides and all the demos will be, and you can run them in your spare time. But they're pretty well done. At the hands-on labs, we'll also have proctors there, so if you do get stuck or have questions, they can answer as well. Last but not least, that's that URL again, where you can go ahead and download this slide deck as well as these demos, the hands-on labs, a whole bunch of other stuff. We also have some white papers out there about ASP.NET and Visual Studio Whidbey that you can check out as well. That site should have gone live a couple hours ago, and so we'll also be updating it throughout the week as we get new content and new demos. And last but not least, if you have any questions, feel free to send me email. My email is scottgu@microsoft.com, and I also have a blog that you can check out as well. So with that, thanks a bunch for coming this week, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks. If there are questions, if you can go to one of the microphones, They told me to stand no more than a foot away from the microphone when you ask your question, and I can go ahead and answer it. And if we run out of time, I will also stick around as long as people have questions, and so can answer everything you have. Question over there.
Yeah, on the when the data was updating the page, you were on the cache. Was that an event model, or was the page actually checking the table each time?
Good question. So the question is, when I was showing that SQL output caching demo, so in other words, we hit the page and the page doesn't refresh unless the data changes, what's going on under the covers? Basically, for our SQL SQL or database cache and validation support, we have two modes of operation depending on what database we're configured against. If you're going against SQL Server Yukon, so the new version of SQL Server, we actually have a notification system now inside SQL that ASP.NET subscribes to, and so we never touch the database. Instead, the database will touch us when an event occurs. And so basically, and the nice thing with Yukon is they can do it both at a table as well as a row level invalidation. So you can even say, oh, only when this row changes will you go ahead and invalidate us. For SQL 7 and SQL 2000, what we do in ASP.NET is we have a polling mechanism. The way the polling mechanism works, though, is it doesn't poll on each page request, because that would kind of defeat the purpose of the cache. Instead, what we do is we basically, you can configure it, and I didn't show it being configured here in the demo. I will in the slide, in the sample I show out. But basically, you configure ASP.NET to have a single background thread, and we'll check the database periodically. I think by default it's every 3 seconds to see whether or not any data has been updated across any of the items that we're caching. So if you have 10,000 output cache pages, we're only checking it once every 3 seconds. And it's just basically doing a quick check to see if any table's updated. If they are, we'll then go ahead and automatically invalidate the cache. But with Yukon, again, you never hit the database. Instead, the database is notifying us whenever a change occurs. And Rob Howard's talk called Advanced Caching, it's happening twice. There's one talk and then a repeat. We'll go into a lot more detail, and I think we'll show both Yukon as well as SQL 7 2000 in action. Good question. So the question here is, okay, works against SQL, can you do it for any other data source? And the answer is yes. All of our APIs, again, have that provider interface. And one of the things that means is you can build a generic cache dependency object that goes against Oracle, goes against MySQL, goes against DB2, goes against LDAP. Rob Howard's going to be showing as part of his talk, I think it's called a SQL or stock web service notification. And so when a stock changes in a web service, he's going to invalidate the cache. And so he'll walk through how do you build that kind of generic cache dependency and plug it in. Can't actually see the microphone there. If anyone has a question, oh, there it is. Okay.
Scott, for master pages, is there an ability to define in the master page a place for metadata where it might have to be entered, say a page title, or even for a custom control that you might flip on and off?
Excellent. So the question is, for a master page, is there any way to define like metadata? So for example, if I want to change the header, if I want to add a style sheet, if I want to go ahead and add a meta tag to the head section, how can I go ahead and do that? Well, so there's two ways you can do it. One is you could put a content placeholder control in the head and replace that at the subpage level, declaratively. We're also adding support. Some of it's in the bits that you'll have. We'll have a little bit more in the alpha or in the beta. So you can programmatically change the title as well as declaratively change the title. You can also, both as a page developer as well as a control developer, now dynamically or programmatically add style sheet references as well as link sections as well as JavaScript references, all programmatically to that head. And so there's now a full API to control title, header, everything you can do in the head directly from the page. And so that'll absolutely work with master pages.
Just as a follow-up, let's say there was a custom control for search, and maybe I wanted to turn it on and off, or I wanted to limit it to a certain department on each page. Would that also be available?
Absolutely. So if you want to go ahead and have like a search page in, say, the master, and you want to only have it available for certain departments or not, one way to do it would be to put the login view control in the master, configure it and say only if you're in the admin group, only show the search control. You could also, within that search control, programmatically toggle whether or not you're on or off depending on what role the user's in. So you could absolutely do that. The other thing I didn't mention about master pages, but we'll be showing during the master page breakout, is that you can actually nest master pages. So you can have one master page that defines the high-level structure, and for portions of your site you can say, I want to slightly override the master page but still inherit from it, and then let content pages inherit from that. And so you can also do nesting master situations for cases where you want to have an overall consistent look and feel, and then sub-portions of the site have different looks and feels. So the answer is absolutely yes.
Is there a direct relationship between the HTTP context current user object and the roles and membership and personalization?
Good question. So the question is, what's the relationship between the HTTP current user object and roles membership and personalization?
Right.
So if you enable the role management system, the role management system will automatically set the user object or fill in the user object with the appropriate roles contexts. So you don't have to write that code in global.sx anymore. We'll automatically do it for you. If you're using membership, membership doesn't actually set authentication. We use the same forms of authentication APIs that we have today in order to set authentication. All the membership does is basically encapsulates validating and creating users and deleting users, etc. So it'll work the way you want it to work, but it's not doing anything super special. It's basically doing the credential management for you.
Okay.
For personalization, the way personalization works, we have two modes of personalization. One is what we call authenticated personalization, which I showed up here. And what that's happening is I'm actually tying the personalization data to the logged in user. We then have another mode that we call anonymous personalization. And what anonymous personalization does is you don't have to be logged in order to actually personalize data about the user. So the canonical scenario is like an Amazon shopping cart, where what I want to be able to do is I want to go ahead and visit Amazon. I want to build up my preferences list without having to log in. I want to add things to my shopping cart. And only when I hit checkout do I actually want to have to log in. And so anonymous personalization lets you do that. It'll actually store the personalization to the browser as opposed to the logged in user. When you log in, we'll then raise an event so you can migrate all the settings from the anonymous personalization object to your authenticated profile object. And that way you can, if they delete, if they close the browser, go to another machine, they'll keep their settings. So Rob Howard's personalization talk will go into much more detail about both anonymous as well as authenticated personalization.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
Is there a timeline for the beta?
So the question is there a timeline for the beta?
Yeah.
Over there. The beta is going to come out in the spring. One thing I should have mentioned is everything that I showed you here, it's about 2/3 of the features finally done. We actually have one more coding milestone that we'we've been working on. It's almost done right now. But the bits that you're getting here are kind of basically from July. So there's a lot of stuff that's in there that will show up in the beta. And that will come out in the early spring time frame, or mid-spring time frame. And that'll be,
sorry.
Oh, and so the two things about the beta, it will be a feature-complete beta. As part of our beta process, we'll also have a go-live license like we did in V1. Unclear whether that's beta 1 or beta 2. But basically that way you'll be able to actually start building apps. And if you choose to, you can actually go ahead and deploy them on the beta 2. And we'll upgrade a lot of core Microsoft properties to be running on beta 2 before we ship as a dog food mechanism.
You have a UIP block that's on MSDN side, which shows the front controller pattern.
Right.
So is there something like that that could be part of Whidbey that you could very easily use in a 3-tier architecture?
Right. So the question here is there's a UIP pattern that's part of the prescriptive architecture guidance, or PAG group, has put out that lets you do kind of model view controller for ASP.NET. Where instead of having a page controller, you can set up a, I forget the name of it, but it's basically a site controller for multiple pages. It's one of the things that we're looking at doing for Whidbey. We're still trying to finalize that. It's not currently in the bits, but it is something that we're thinking about. And so we probably will have something, whether it's built into Whidbey or it's a web download, we probably will have something specifically if you want to do a kind of very crisp model view controller model, you can apply that to Whidbey. Two things that we do have that I will be showing in my cool tips and tricks talk is cross-page postback, which makes building kind of an MVC pattern a lot easier. And so specifically, you can now take controls, and rather than always post back to the same page, you can direct them to other pages and then actually get access to those controls on that other page. So you could build like a controller page that handles postbacks for multiple pages. The other thing that we also have is a new wizard control. That's one of the new sort of 45 new controls I mentioned. And the wizard control basically lets you do next, previous navigation style flow layout, or a navigation layout on the single page. So it doesn't handle multiple page scenarios. But for cases where you're trying to collect multiple data and optionally go back to step 2 if they filled something out wrong, we do have a wizard control that will help you do that on a single page. And I'll be showing both of those in my cool tips and tricks talk on Wednesday.
Thanks.
How fixed are the interfaces for, over here, how fixed are the interfaces for like the membership where, so, we know if we can start looking at our own roll your own scenarios right now, how well they'll integrate with that.
Good questions. The question is, how fixed are the interfaces for things like membership or role management, et cetera? And at what point can you start saying, hey, they're baked enough that I can start building on top of them? In general, I'd say that the APIs themselves, the names are going to change slightly. Specifically between the bits you have right now and the beta, we're actually going to keep the same APIs, but basically switch from an interface to an abstract base class implementation. Mainly so we don't have to have kind of EX in the next version, and we can more easily introduce new functionality in subsequent releases. In terms of the actual functionality that you expose on your object, though, it's fairly baked right now. So there might be some renames, but the actual functionality that you need to implement as a membership provider will basically stay pretty much the same. And Rob's going to go into more detail about what that API looks like, and will actually, I think, walk through for membership actually building one of those providers from scratch, as well as some code samples that'll show you how. And so if you're interested in that, I would definitely recommend going to his membership talk and role management talk, as well as his personalization talk, where I think he's going to talk a little bit more about the provider architecture in general. Certainly for the beta time frame, the APIs will be very locked. Question?
Most of the companies use standard code checker, or basically coding standards which need to be implemented within the organization or within the project. Do you have something in Whidbey?
Yeah, so the question is, companies often have, specifically enterprise companies have, want to be able to apply policy at development time that enforce, say, code standards or consistency standards throughout the code. What do we have for that in Whidbey? We have a couple of different things, and it depends on kind of where in the project that you're at. But we do have the ability to sort of lock down from a profile perspective what the developer can and can't do within the IDE. From a formatting and stylistic perspective, one of the things that we're introducing in Whidbey is the ability to import and export settings. And so one of the things you could do is, as a development organization, you could say, here's the exact style guidelines I'm going to use, both for HTML, for all my tags, for all my controls, as well as for my code, and basically apply that across the entire development team. So regardless of what tool you used, it's going to go ahead and format things identically. And then at the enterprise level, there's the policy piece where you can actually go ahead and implement specific guidelines and practices that you want to enforce in terms of naming conventions, in terms of what you can create and not. I don't know all the details about the lockdown in the IDE, but there's a couple talks a little bit later this week specifically focused, I think they're in the tools track. It's called Visual Studio Whidbey Enterprise Development or Enterprise Design. And they would be the best people to ask, and they should be able to either show a demo or describe in more depth about what they support.
Excuse me.
Where is the...
So I think someone in the back is trying to break in and say that I'm out of time.
Hello?
Hello. So what I'll actually do is, for people that still have questions, come on up here, and I'll answer them without the mic totally on. We'll let the other speaker, someone here is, Don, okay. I was worried there for a moment. But then I just realized it was Don. But I can answer your questions as long as you have them. And once we get kicked off, and we'll eventually let Don start, I can go outside and I can answer questions there as well. Last but not least, there's an Ask the Expert session tomorrow night. I'll be there as well and can answer questions as late as people have them. Thanks a bunch.